It's about to get a bit more expensive to go and see your doctor, and GPs say it's all the government's fault. Who's winning the political battle over the Adler shotgun, and why is Tony Abbott weighing in? Voting early and often. 18,000 Australians asked to explain why they appear to have cast more than one ballot. Joining us on the panel tonight, Guardian Australia journalist Paul Farrell, cross-cultural consultant Tasneem Chopra, and the Executive Director of Schools in the Catholic Diocese of Parramatta, Greg Whitby. And you can join in as well on Twitter or on Facebook. If it's on Twitter, use the hashtag #TheDrum. Well, seeing your doctor will soon cost you $78, and unless you're bulk billed, less than half of that will be covered by Medicare. The Australian Medical Association has today recommended doctors put up their prices by $2 per standard visit, and they continue to demand that the government lift the freeze on the medical benefits schedule patient rebate. The indexation of the MBS rebate has been on hold itself for 2 years, and it'll stay that way on current legislation until at least 2020. And so doctors say that they are being forced to increase the costs to their patients and bulk bill less of them.
Every day the freeze remains in place is another day that patients are paying more out of pocket for their medical services, or that some patients will be forced to have to look at an option other than bulk billing because their doctor will no longer be able to provide services bulk billed to them.
I think our GPs are being squeezed to breaking point. It's not so much what has changed between this month and next month. What's happened is that we've seen this government for 3 years putting pressure on the cost of healthcare. The GPs have tried to hold the line, but they're finding it too hard.
We respect and we value that doctors are small businesses and they have scope to set their fees according to their wishes, their business model and their patient cohort. And I'm delighted that in this space we have a bulk billing rate of 85.1%.
So, what to make of this increase? Is it justified? Tasneem, $40 out of pocket to see your GP. That's getting up there a bit. Is this the Medicare that we've all grown up to expect?
The Medicare? Look, I'm not sure. I think on one hand you're talking about government claiming they respect doctors' efforts and that they're running small businesses and that it's much more than just a medical enterprise. But on the other hand, how do you counter that respect with a freeze on the Medicare rebate that's been in place and will now be in place till 2020? So doctors are provided to provide as much as they did, if not more. Their rebate is frozen, but their costs are increasing. So there's a definite, there's no correlation between the two, and I think the government needs to step up. I think the GPs are right. This is the government's responsibility, and rather than for the patients to continuously have to fork out what the government should be supporting when it doesn't provide the same freeze to other industries, I think is the big question. And
when, Paul, you see doctors saying that we are bulk billing less as a result of this, potentially you get into that territory where there is rationing of healthcare. People are potentially thinking, oh, maybe I won't get the blood test because this isn't a good week.
Well, exactly. And of course, as we know from the US-style healthcare system, that when people start bringing that kind of attitude into their thinking with their healthcare decisions, the ramifications end up being far worse down the track because, things that could be caught earlier on aren't resolved and health conditions continue to escalate and grow worse and worse. And I think that kind of deterrent and whether people are, possibly thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't go, it's $40, it's a big deal, that would be really, really alarming. And I think, just personally, I certainly, $40 does give you sort of pause for concern, and there would be many people who, really are not well off who that really does have a huge impact on. And we know from when Tony Shepherd did the Commission of Audit that a price signal was seen as a way of limiting people using Medicare services, and that was when advocating for a $5 copay. We're talking $2 here, not $5 here, but this is almost that copayment that was so controversial by stealth, isn't it? Well, possibly. Look, I think it's a little bit difficult to, and I think we should be cautious about conflating this with the sort of the Medicare and with these ideas about privatisation and things like that, because this is a very distinct and discrete issue, and it's an issue that could be resolved very easily, and that's by the government simply reversing this freeze. You look at the amount of funding that goes into all kinds of different areas, and you don't see any, as has been said, you don't see any kind of similar freezes. So why freezes on something so basic and so vital for healthcare needs? It just doesn't make sense.
So, Greg, I mean, clearly the government is looking to limit the growth in costs in Medicare. It's very expensive as it is. It's only getting more so. Do we as healthcare consumers have to either accept that if you can afford it, you will have to pay more, either over the doctor's desk or a higher Medicare levy, or there must be some mechanism, higher taxes? I mean, it's got to be paid for.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's the jewel in the crown, and we should depoliticise this to a sense, because we all agree that it's well worth it. The answer, however, is not to throw more money at it necessarily. I think that's the issue here. The 20% levy and the surcharge is just only paying 20% of the cost. The rest has to come out of the public purse, and that's escalating. We can't live in an environment where we just continually escalate and pay more. I think there are two areas. I mean, the point is that receiving Commonwealth funding for a small business brings with it some requirements. So I think there is an onus on the doctors to ensure that they are doing what they can do to limit the costs. It's not an unfettered right to charge what you want. The other side of it is, I'd like to see more discussion at the preventative end. How do we target the funds that we have? So if you're into the prevention, and it's the same across other, in the education sector we face this, there are just no more funds. So how do we do these things differently? We certainly know the earlier you get in, the more likely you are to get a better outcome. I think they're two things that can come into debate, rather than saying, let's give more money to it.
Tasneem, do you think that there is something to be gained by squeezing the doctors just a little bit? Because if you put the screws on them by freezing the rebate for a few years, it does force them to look for efficiencies, maybe not make those referrals to unnecessary tests and so on, that actually, there can be ways of saving some costs.
I think time will tell if that works or not. But I think in the meantime, let's not forget a typical scenario of a family GP is, sometimes a parent presenting with 1, 2 or 3 children. Now, these costs will escalate. And if the tendency, as Paul mentioned, would be to maybe not go and seek that additional help, you're inadvertently going to put a squeeze on other services, like emergency services, which, as we know in this country, are already working to the hilt, and receiving cases which could easily be seen by a GP. But under this potential scenario, that will only just get worse. So I think by cutting off their nose to spite their face, the government's actually going to stress other areas of the medical industry.
So do you think, Paul, this in and of itself, I mean, $2 is $2. For some people it's a lot, for some people not a lot at all. Does this justify the kinds of warnings that Labor was gaining so much ground on politically during the campaign?
I'm not sure it justifies them, because it is a very different issue to what Labor were articulating. But it certainly does show that the government has taken, perhaps a more hostile attitude to publicly funded medical services than it should be. But I do also agree with Greg as well that we doctors should also be looking to make these savings as well. And of course, the AMA's ruling on this is essentially just a guideline. Doctors can still make a determination to charge less. They can make their own determination to bulk bill. And perhaps sometimes there should be a much greater focus on looking at how these doctors are charging people and what they are charging as well.
Yeah, I mean, and Greg, it's obviously important to remember that even if your general practitioner is now suddenly no longer bulk billing you, and maybe they were up until a year or two ago and suddenly they're not, you do have the option of going down the road. You can find a bulk billing GP if you need to.
Well, it would seem that way if everything was right and we all had access to transport and all those sort of things. I think they'd become distractors. The issue is the efficiency of it, and then how we look at both the income side and the expenditure side. That's how we've got to frame this. There are many ways you go about it. Certainly, we're the envy of the Western world in the way we look after people, and we'd want to keep that commitment. So I think there are creative ways around it, even things like using technologies for diagnostics, and I'm not talking going Dr. Google, but the sort of things, we've already got nurse practitioners, so we don't keep building in higher escalating costs. So That's the area I think we've got to look to address this.
All right, let's keep our focus on Canberra, because the debate over the controversial Adler lever-action shotgun continued in the national capital today. The weapons became an unlikely bargaining chip over the reinstatement of the construction industry watchdog yesterday, and the PM ultimately ruled out watering down gun laws. National Party MPs, though, have since spoken out in favour of lifting the import ban after a New South Wales state government proposal emerged, which would see the shotgun able to be imported for specific purposes, things like culling wild pigs. But now former Prime Minister Tony Abbott has weighed in, warning against the move.
I'm just tired of law-abiding firearm owners who are getting blamed with some bleeding heart emotion that is just inaccurate, being blamed for problems with firearms or not being trusted with firearms when they're already regulated by the state.
The sporting shooters and farmers in my electorate, they should be able to have the tools of the trade that they need to undertake either their work or their chosen sport, and to connect this to to mass shootings or crimes or whatever, quite frankly, is abhorrent to me and to the people that I represent.
With a heightened terror threat, the last thing we should have is a flood of rapid-fire guns coming into our country. And as far as I was concerned, we were never going to allow these guns into our country other than on the same basis of semi-automatic weapons. This idea that shooters generally should have access to rapid-fire weapons is just crackers, and it should never happen as far as I'm concerned.
It is estimated there are already more than 250,000 illegal firearms in Australia, including automatic and semi-automatic weapons, the kind banned after the Port Arthur massacre 20 years ago. So, Tasneem, should that be the issue? Because the Prime Minister in question time today was sort of saying that we really need to be looking at the country is already awash with illegal weapons, much more deadly than this Adler shotgun, which has suddenly just become the focus of this debate.
Yeah, I think he's inadvertently conflated two issues, and I think the issue of illegal arms has to be dealt with in and of itself, because I think that issue and the associated risks of that issue to the population through domestic violence and random acts of violence against people is something that we need to address as a state. And that has to be on the table before and after the Adler debate, regardless. I think with the Adler debate, what we're seeing, and from what I've gathered, is that this is going to be a different classification of weapon, far more training and requirement and licensing would be needed to get it. So it does seem to be a different ball game, so to speak, to the illegal firearms that we understand as Tony Abbott mentioned, are a huge vice in the community.
One of the points the Prime Minister made was to say, well, we do know that a lot of illegal firearms are used in crimes, including, for instance, the Sydney siege, the Lint Cafe siege. That was an illegal shotgun that was being used. And that in this age of terrorism, we need to be looking at this as an issue, that it really is the central issue here, not just a gun that some farmers might want to kill some pigs with.
Yeah, look, not a big fan of guns, not a big fan of pigs, but having said that, while I can see the argument being made by farmers, I think that has to be resolved by hearing. I think they should be representing themselves on this issue. In terms of gun issues and illegal guns, I think that however, is a different issue that all the community needs to step up on.
Yeah, Paul, I mean, I know you've been looking at this particular weapon. We've spoken to and heard from a number of people in the farming sector today, tried to get a number of them onto the program to talk about it. Some say, look, this is just another gun. It's not that much better than what we've got. We don't really need it. Others saying this is an important tool. But, I mean, what's your understanding? Is this so radically different to what's already out there, legal in the hands of farmers and others?
Well, look, I think just to start with, there is so much misdirection and lack of clarity about what is actually being discussed here. So what the federal government actually did was ban imports on all lever-action shotguns that were exceeded 5 magazine cartridges. And they did that because the new Adler A10 concerned them so particularly much with its particular capabilities.
Right.
But
so the lever action means you can reload faster, shoot again faster than if you're plugging them in and shooting them off.
Yeah, and yet the concern is that lever-action shotguns are all Category A firearms. They are easier to obtain than Category D firearms, for instance, which is where you will find pump-action shotguns. Now, if you speak to any of the farmers here, there is not much difference between a pump-action shotgun and a lever-action shotgun. They do the same thing. So why on earth are they categorised so differently, and why is it so easy to gain lever-action shotguns? So the federal government said, all right, we're going to do this ban, while COAG and the joint councils, the joint governments are sorting this out. And now what we're seeing is pushes from the Nationals and pushes from the gun lobby to try to manipulate this debate and make it about the Adler and make it about this. But actually what we're talking about is a very big and a very serious issue. And I don't think the case has been made by Troy Grant or by any of these individuals about why this ban initially should be moved and why the category of this firearm should remain where it is.
So in essence, the ban is to determine how do we classify this gun, how restricted is it, who can get a hold of it. But ultimately the debate to be resolved is this going to be classified like another kind of shotgun, or is it going to be more like a pump action?
Exactly. And just to give an example of lever action, I wish we could, bring up this footage, but, Terminator 2, the very famous footage of Arnold Schwarzenegger getting on his motorcycle and twirling around the shotgun in his fingers. That's a lever action shotgun. And you can see the speed with which he fires it. I know it's a, slightly outrageous example. I mean, I wish we could get the footage up. Can we do that? I should have raised this before. But anyway, but that is exactly the kind of weapon that we are talking about. That's a lever action shotgun. And they fire rapidly. And I think Tony Abbott is, I find myself very much agreeing with him that we really shouldn't be winding this back at all.
Yeah, I mean, Greg, what's your take on this? Because some farmers are saying, look, this just gives us a couple of extra shots to kill a group of pigs, and often, families of pigs and so on. There's 10 of them there, and you get kind of only a short amount of time to get rid of them. And otherwise, they're digging up your crops and killing your sheep and doing all sorts of things.
I never knew that we had such a pig problem that's emerged in this discussion, and I don't know the issues about. I think the issue, however, that we face in Australia was actually dealt with by John Howard in 1996. It took 1 million guns out of Australia, and the Australians were amazed at how many guns. 20 years later, they're back. Now, the issue is that a good thing to do? It's the broader debate, the pump versus the lever action. The issue is that we want to live in a society where we can get some guarantee we're going to keep guns in the hands of those who need guns to do things. And it just doesn't necessarily mean, just because you have a right to that, that you therefore can have it. Because we should be addressing that issue of what happened in the 20 years that allowed that to come back.
Yeah, indeed. Now, as well, I mean, some have suggested there are echoes of the New South Wales greyhound racing ban in all of this. You've effectively got a city elite, a political elite that doesn't know what these guns are for, doesn't know how many pigs there are to shoot, etc., saying that we think this is too dangerous, this is a public threat, and for particularly sporting shooters and so on, we don't want them holding this. Is there a kind of a cultural divide on this?
I think there is. I think your pro-gun lobby are never going to see another way. That's my understanding. Certainly in America, we know it's gospel there, literally. In Australia, I think that we're not actually seeing the parties talk to each other. So it's almost as if, farmers and guns have operated in a silo compared to what the rest of the population and community understand. And now this issue is actually bringing it to the surface. We're finding out about the difference between pump action and whatnot, and that we have this many pigs in the country, for example. So this is news. But we need to come to an outcome that's going to ensure maximum safety.
What about the politics of this, Paul? I mean, obviously, any time Tony Abbott bobs up, people go, "What's he up to? He's having another crack at Turnbull. Is he trying to wedge him from the National Party?" I mean, how do you read this? What is going on politically?
Well, I mean, I think definitely Tony Abbott's comments particularly are resonating with the core Liberal Party base because, I mean, as Greg mentioned, this is sort of John Howard's big legacy, gun control, and the appearance that the Turnbull government may be wavering in that position is certainly something that you could see might be an opportunity for Tony Abbott as well.
He's doing 7:30 tonight with Lee as well, so he's certainly not being shy.
Well, look, it's certainly going to be interesting to see what happens on there. But I do think as well there is this quite insipid cultural trend happening in Australia where there is this kind of mimicry of this US gun culture. And I've certainly done some investigations and stories of this kind of growing and increasingly growing extreme gun culture for these people that feel like it is a right for them to bear arms almost. It's not a right, it is a privilege, and it is one that should be very carefully moderated by the state.
Do you see that? I mean, is it just purely coincidental that this is happening now? 20 years ago, Port Arthur, the rise of Pauline Hanson, similar set of racial tensions potentially? I mean, is that just coincidental, or is there something going on?
Well, I think the biggest coincidence in why this is all coming up is, of course, that the National Firearms Review is now, which is a statutory review that was required to happen. And that is the opportunity that the gun lobby is taking to push to change the categorisation of weapons and to kind of push their own agenda. So that's where this is coming from. But it has, of course, been conflated in the rise and, the polarisation of politics in Australia and all around the world.
All right, let's stay political and talk about the way our democracy functions. The old saying, vote early, vote often. It seems quite a few of us have taken that adage rather to heart. More than 18,000 people have been asked to please explain why the records show that they voted more than once in this year's federal election. The Electoral Commissioner, Tom Rogers, was before Senate estimates and said that 2 people at least had their names marked off the electoral roll no fewer than 11 times on election day. Now, a lot of those 18,000 cases are expected to be mistakes, although in 2013, if you look at the data from that, there were more than 8,000 cases of suspected voter fraud referred to the federal police. And that led to absolutely 0 convictions. So, do we need to be doing more to try and ensure that nobody gets more than 1 vote, Greg Whitby?
Well, I think we do. In a democracy, everybody needs 1 vote. The issue around here, I think, is of course, walking in and just having your name marked off in 2016, I think we've moved on a little bit more about security. So identification is critical. I think the second thing is looking at new ways of doing this and doing sort of things electronically, particularly in an age where we're playing politics at the margins and the focus is always on the marginal electorates. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't know, forget which electorate, but one of them came down to 7 votes in the end. So, I mean, if that person voted 11 times, they got them over the line.
So it could be decisive.
Yeah, so it could be very decisive, because what concerns me is the political machinery saying, well, the votes are in the marginals. All we have to do is just get over the line.
This whole 1 vote, 1 value thing, it's a fairly recent concept. For a long time, if you had property, you got more votes, that sort of thing. I mean, if you're that engaged, that politically motivated, that you want to vote 11 times, shouldn't you get more votes than somebody who really doesn't care? They're quite apathetic. They just happen to be in a marginal seat and they get to cast a deciding vote. How fair is that?
Well, I think Winston Churchill said, democracy's a terrible thing. It's the best solution we've got at the moment to do things. So I think it is a very serious issue that does need to be addressed, and we can look at different ways to do it. Like we've just done the census online. I know it had problems. I hate to quote the United States, but many of the United States now use electronic voting, and they're all subject to those sorts of things. But the fundamental principle of everybody being able to have a say and participate fully in the democracy is what we're talking about.
Yeah. Tasneem, given that, I mean, Greg talks about ID, for instance, for voting. Sounds like a good and reasonable idea, but as soon as you ask people for voter ID, then potentially, what are we going to have, Australia card again? I mean, what sort of ID is going to be acceptable? Are you going to disenfranchise the homeless or other people that may not be able to get this form of identification?
I think we need to be creative about checks and balances. So whether that's photo ID, whether that's retinal scans, whatever the cost is that's going to be involved has to be considered. If we ban people, if we fine people for not voting, we need to fine them for overvoting. If 8,000 people in 2013 got away with voting more than once, I mean, I say got away, did literally no penalty whatsoever. I mean, that's quite telling.
Well, it's kind of impossible to prove, because with the anonymity and so on. I mean, if somebody says, well, you've been ticked off the voting roll 5 times in your electorate, and you say, well, I only voted once. That's kind of that ends the discussion.
Part of the checks and balances is to have that ID to ensure that you don't vote multiple times, and if you do, you're caught out and there's a penalty.
Many of the countries on the subcontinent have a very, very simple, low-cost solution: indelible ink on your finger.
Yeah, right.
So, show me your finger.
What do you think, Paul? I mean, given that, unlike most countries, we're one of like 4 countries in the world that has compulsory voting. So with compulsory voting, could we actually go to that kind of biometrics, compulsory retinal scans or fingerprint testing to prove you are who you say you are?
I think perhaps it's my libertarian streak that is going to make me vehemently disagree with the rest of the panel on this particular point. No, I absolutely don't support ID cards or biometric scans or anything like that, because I think as soon as you do that, you do automatically disenfranchise a very large portion of the population. You have issues with data retention. All those kind of issues are thrown up.
But if you don't do it, you overly enfranchise the people that want to go out and vote 11 times.
Well, look, I mean, 18,000 is a number that's been floated about, but what I would like to see is a breakdown of that by electorate. I'd love to see exactly what the impact or the potential impact of that would have been on any votes.
But in the Senate, it could be significant, potentially. And if you've got social media organising it, who knows?
Well, potentially. And then in that case, you know, if there was evidence that it had materially affected a vote, then I'd certainly be very keen to find a sort of solution to this. But I'm just not sure that the case has been made, although this figure is quite exceptional. I'm just not sure the case has actually been made that this is a major problem that really needs to be addressed with such drastic action. Or at least.
Well, let's continue the sort of electoral tampering theme, because the founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, an Australian of course, has had his internet connection shut down after releasing more of those stolen emails linked to the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign. The government of Ecuador has pulled the plug on Assange, who of course has been living in their embassy in London since 2012 to avoid extradition to Sweden, where he's accused of rape. WikiLeaks has released tens of thousands of emails from the Clinton campaign chairman John Podesta's Gmail account, as well as previously secret transcripts of speeches that Hillary made to Wall Street banks. Ecuador has released this statement. It says it respects the principle of non-intervention in the international affairs of other nations and their electoral processes, and has denied it bowed to pressure from another country to take Assange offline. Now, Paul, this is a fascinating one, because some would argue, and maybe you with your libertarian streak would argue as well, that, you know, even if these are hacked emails, the voters of America have a right to know if Hillary Clinton's emails say something nefarious about it before they make her the most powerful politician on the planet.
Well, setting aside my libertarian streak, that's absolutely what my journalistic instincts and the sort of ethical framework that I would approach journalism with would tell me. Look, I deal a lot with leaked documents and confidential sources and things like that. And the reality is that, you know, almost every time you do a story that has an enormous public interest and you get some sort of, leaked series of documents, because of the kind of draconian laws that we have, someone somewhere along the line could be committing an offence. Now, does that invalidate the report? Does it invalidate the public interest in the journalism? No. And I think equally, it doesn't invalidate WikiLeaks findings of those emails.
Does it invalidate the WikiLeaks findings of the emails that this isn't some sort of well-meaning, whistleblower? This is, according to the Obama administration, Russian intelligence saying, here, WikiLeaks, publish this, you'll like this.
Well, I think the material stands absolutely on its own if it's genuine. And if WikiLeaks had no part in inducing the release or the unlawful retention of that material, then I think there is completely public interest in the publication of that material. In the same way that, the New York Times publication of Donald Trump's tax returns was completely in the public interest. I mean, they know nothing about that source. That source could have been a Russian agent for all they know. It could have been an American agent. Who knows? It could have been anyone. So you really, I think that when you get to that point, any journalist or WikiLeaks, should certainly consider the motivations of their source, but it shouldn't invalidate the substance and the content of the material.
What do you think on that point, Tasneem? The idea that it doesn't really matter, ultimately it stands on its merits, the material, it doesn't matter, even if this is from Russian intelligence wanting to tip the election to Donald Trump, if it's about Hillary, we need to know about it.
Look, a smoking gun is a smoking gun. And just because you're not going to let it out doesn't mean it's not bad. It doesn't mean it's not of the public interest. And I think there's an irony to concealing information that could prove illegalities, if in fact people need to know about these illegalities so that they know who they're voting for. So you can't subvert legal information about illegal activities because the subject in question thinks that would be illegal.
But when we're not talking about illegalities, when we're talking about different campaign members working for Hillary Clinton talking about their strategy against Bernie Sanders, or the DNC talking about it. But
you're specifically talking about the release of these documents likely to impinge on the way people then will view the electoral process and will view Hillary and will view, her campaign. It will tarnish that. And if it's going to tarnish that, there's a reason why. And I think the public have a reason to know why.
Are you unsettled at all, Greg, by the fact that WikiLeaks has leaked consistently against the Democrats and Hillary Clinton, but not against Donald Trump?
I don't have a position on that either way, and they favour one or the other. I think there's a core principle here, and that's the issue of your right to privacy. I mean, the issues that are dealt with there, they all happen in a context. And what you're missing is the context of a range of those things and the purposes. Just having information exposed in and of itself, you can read a whole range of it. Now, we're in a big discussion in this country about the issue of metadata. Australians expect that their information will be kept private, and they're very vociferous about it. You wouldn't like your bank statements just open because somebody was suspicious that you might be doing something.
Now, this is on John Podesta's email. I mean, that's hardly high encryption, private server stuff.
I think Joe Citizen is very different to someone who's, aspiring for political office to lead a country.
There's a core principle, though. It has to apply. You can't be selective about it, and that's the issue of being in a democracy. Right. There are checks and balances, and there are some good and there's some bad. Some win, some lose, and that sort of thing. But it's the core principle.
All right, on that core principle, we're out of time. That is all for another edition of The Drum. Thank you to our panellists tonight, Paul Farrell, Tasneem Chopra and Greg Whitby. Julia Baird with you tomorrow night. I'll see you for the third presidential debate, live from 11:30 Eastern Time, and on Friday night for this week's Planet America. Good night.
There has never been so many lies, so much deception. She has tremendous hate in her heart.